Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We don't quite know when you're watching this conversation today. My name is Klara Jordan, and I'm the Chief Public Policy Officer at the CyberPeace Institute. It's my great pleasure to host today Wendy Nather, Head of Advisory CISOs at CISCO, for a conversation. I read a couple of weeks ago Wendy's RSA conference advisory board predictions. And in her predictions, Wendy touched on a lot of the things that are very close to the work of the CyberPeace Institute, mainly the idea of altruism in cybersecurity. So it's really great to have Wendy here. We are hoping that you will find this discussion interesting. So Wendy, welcome to this conversation, and thank you for accepting the invitation.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Wendy, as I mentioned, I did read with great interest your RSA predictions, and I would like for you to first share with our audiences really what was your thoughts on the shift to altruism in cybersecurity, what it means, why now, and why it's important. So let's just start with really what did you think, what were your thoughts when you talked about that we will see next year a shift to very different thinking in cybersecurity?
Yes, what was I thinking? At the time, I was very aware, as we're all aware, that there are more and more incidents that demonstrate how interlinked we are in cybersecurity, how we are all dependent on one another, how there are ripple effects in breaches. I read a great report by the Scientia Institute together with Risk Recon from MasterCard, where they talked about the ripple effects on third parties of breaches. And there were things like one of the ransomware events that affected Blackbaud actually affected 550 other organizations, including nonprofits. And so I don't think most people understand yet the full scope of how interconnected we are as an ecosystem, but they're starting to. And that's why I believe that from a pragmatic standpoint, at the very least, we will see more people talking about how we need to work together.
Thank you for that introduction, Wendy. So you've talked about how you read the report and that we're really interconnected, that we depend on each other. Beyond that, what makes you think that sort of the time is ripe now for this shift? We observe these breaches, we observe these really negative consequences, sort of that ripple through so many communities and so many targets and victims. Why now you think that this will change? What's happened in, let's say, 2021 that makes this the right moment for different thinking?
Well, I think part of it, honestly, is the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, where we see over and over and over again that we have to help the vulnerable, not just say, I got my shots, so I'm fine. I don't care about anybody else. That the ripple effects of the vulnerable people being affected also affects the rest of the world. And so there's kind of a physical world counterpart to the cybersecurity breaches and events. We are just still dealing with the Log4j vulnerability that everyone is having to deal with. And in both cases, you see groups of people now springing up to try to help one another. In the US, the CISA just set up an open source Log4j tool for people to use. And you're seeing not only help for groups during breaches, but you're also seeing more and more groups coming together to help people in cybersecurity who are stressed, people who need more support. Just this year, a new group was stood up called RISIS, which is an organization to help Latinos and Latinas and Hispanic professionals get the support they need in cybersecurity. I am on the advisory board for Sightline Security, which is a nonprofit that helps other nonprofits secure themselves. And so I think the timing is just kind of coming together with a push from the physical world to start helping each other the way that we really need to pull together in the physical world.
I think, we're more and more understanding there's no such a thing as the physical and cyber world, that really we're seeing how they are connected, how they impact us, and how the behaviors that we see manifested in the physical world, then we see them online and vice versa. At the Institute, we often talk about sort of the difference between the target and the victim, and how we are all, should all be working for the benefit of the ecosystem. Oftentimes we discuss with our stakeholders what we risk if we don't change this attitude. What is really here at stake when it comes to our connectivity or technology or the physical world if we don't change the sort of the negative trends. What do you think we risk if we don't make that shift to altruism? What do we risk if we continue to remediate, react, and sort of work through the stovepipes and sort of caring for our little gardens rather for the ecosystem?
Well, I'm concerned about that too, because having been in the field for, 35 years or so, a lot of this was very separate and very theoretical at the time. And as cybersecurity has spread to cover all technology, which is itself spreading into every area of our lives, there are still groups of people who feel as though this is very theoretical. The ones and zeros are just kind of, I don't know, reindeer games, where one group is getting points against another group, and they are not realizing that, there are people behind this that are truly affected. If you just look at the nonprofit sector, nonprofit, I like to say, is the other critical infrastructure. And people don't realize that if they are taken down for whatever reason, they can't fulfill their mission. So people who would have been fed go starving, people who have no shelter still don't have it. No first responders can help in disasters. People cannot be protected from their abusers, those who've been victimized by human trafficking or domestic abuse. The list goes on and on. And so another huge part of our critical infrastructure is endangered with cybersecurity attacks. And so I think we do need to make this clearer, and pointing out that we are all affected either directly or indirectly by this infrastructure that supports everybody. Even if you personally are not standing in line at a food bank, you are affected by whether people get fed. So I don't know. I think we need to talk more about this.
These themes are very, very close, to our heart, and we try to really point to these, sort of to these equities, that if those who are supposed to, provide the food, they can't do it, or they're held to ransom and they have to pay to be able to operate, it's ultimately the whole society that suffers. And the Institute is actually thinking very seriously about how can we actually talk and measure the societal costs of cyber attacks, not just the technical remediation, the cost of security, but what it costs to the society as a whole in sort of lost opportunities. And these are very, very, very difficult discussions. For example, we know that the NGO sector, we give $30 billion a year to the NGO sector. We still don't know how much of it goes to ransomware. We know that's quite a big portion because it's starting to be measured. But ultimately, we all pay that price because it is our contribution to these causes that's then get lost. I mean, I think from a lot of the work you've done and a lot of the work the Institute has done, we're really trying to bring the individual into the center of our conversations. And I think if the security and technology are ultimately about the people, and the technology has this opportunity and the potential to improve human conditions, what do you think we can do to ensure that consideration, that individual consideration, is the key equity when we are making the decision, whether it's in the world where you sit with the technical folks, or in the policy conversations or geopolitical conversations? How do we bring the individual and human into center of those discussions and considerations?
That is such a good question. I'm so glad you asked it. I believe, I'm a firm believer in the power of storytelling, that the more people hear actual stories about individuals, the more they can relate themselves to what's going on. So we do still have a problem with researchers for whom finding a vulnerability is just a matter of making money and solving an interesting problem and getting credit. And they don't see beyond that to the human costs. So we need to bring those stories to them. There's another great statistic in this Scientia ripple effect report that I mentioned, that in cases where there were downstream breach effects on third parties from a breach, 1 out of 4 times the victims end up paying all the costs for the original breach. In other words, it's not just the original breached organization that has to pay the costs, it's the downstream victims who didn't even get breached who end up carrying the costs of that breach. So that's another thing that I think we need to tell stories about and make it clear. The problem in cybersecurity is we keep things very secret and classified, and I feel as though it's part of my job as a former CISO and analyst and research director to be able to tell stories that other CISOs are not allowed to, because we have to get those stories out there.
No, that's absolutely right, and those, bringing that human face to the security stories is so important, that those who make the decisions really understand and realize who and how they impact the individual at the end. We discussed a bit your previous positions really as a CISO, and now in your role really thinking about these strategically. What do you think are some of those operational, technical measures that we can adapt or we can adopt to operationalize that altruism we discussed? Do you see any sort of technical policy, operational initiatives that are aiming at, bringing that closer to us?
I am not sure myself. Of course, there is incentivizing altruism, but you can't really force altruism. That takes us in another direction of policy, which is, of course, a valid option. And if we find that globally the effects of these breaches are wide enough that it serves the public good to enforce more collective action, then I'm sure that's what we will end up doing. The problem is that there is an undercurrent of, shall we say, anarchy to cybersecurity, the hacker ethos, where there are still parts of the culture that really chafe against any kind of attempt to control cybersecurity. On the other hand, a lot of us are used to an authoritarian model of cybersecurity where the only place that you would have technology is from your employer, and they would dictate how you were to use that technology. Obviously, that time is done. Technology has been democratized. We need to democratize security models on top of it. But we need to keep reaching out to, other parts of the world, of the culture, to handle this disconnect between control of security and empowerment to secure oneself. And I think we'll be doing that for many, many years.
I think there's been quite a big road sort of we've gone for quite a while where we are today. But I do think that oftentimes we talk about, changing the cultures in a boardroom or changing the culture, of the lawyers. But I mean, oftentimes we also forget those other cultures that are part of the cybersecurity, and it's one of the areas where I think that where we have the most work to do collectively, is to bring those cultures together. I mean, speaking of culture, I'd love to hear, in your work, you mentioned storytelling, but were there some other things that really helped you to sort of change the mindset or shape the mindset of your audiences, to help them understand and appreciate the impact of the decisions they were making, on the ecosystem? What was powerful? What worked? What resonates with people? You mentioned stories, but is there some other ways we can sort of incentivize in our advocacy work, outreach work, writing the audiences to think differently?
Well, not just storytelling, but of course, using as many different languages as you need to build that rapport with the person you're communicating with. It's funny, when I was in primary school, I took one of these aptitude tests, and it told me that I should be in the Foreign Service. And so I was telling that to one of my colleagues the other day, and she said, well, actually, you kind of are in the Foreign Service. So, trying to bridge the gap between many, many different decision makers and consumers of technology and security. So when I was a CISO, the head of equities trading came to me and said, if I plug in this modem, how much more insecure are we going to be? And I said, I don't know, 5. And so I ended up creating a chart for him, which really spoke his language. It didn't mean much statistically, but it expressed it in the way that he wanted to see it. And I think that's where we have to go, is to discuss the risks and costs and rewards of and our responsibilities, frankly, of cybersecurity with all these different cultures, but doing it in the way that is meaningful to them.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting how you talk about, without saying the word, the being the translator of a lot of those concepts, and how to make the work understandable, easy to implement. I don't know, I think complexity has been sort of our enemy on so many different levels. So really that work of translating is becoming absolutely key, because now it's really touching on everyone's roles, responsibility, organization. So we have to find the right language. I want to end on a positive note, and I'd love to hear what were some of your highlights of 2021 in terms of your work, or the things you've seen in the community of the ecosystem? What made you go, the world is going to be okay, the world of cybersecurity is going to be okay? So what were some of those highlights? But also I'd like to just hear what you're hopeful for 2022.
Well, it's hard to say. That the last 2 years have been kind of strange. And I would have to say that one of the highlights of my year has been having the ability to sneak out in between pandemic waves to go to a couple of conferences. I went to one in Bern and I went to one in Israel. And just to see people again and have the kind of fresh, spontaneous conversations that you can't have when you have to schedule a video meeting. It was good for the soul. It just meant so much to me. So my hope for 2022 is that everybody can have more chances to do that, because I feel as though we've become more separated by circumstances. And again, it's easy to forget that there are living people on the other side of these ones and zeros. It's easy to fall in love with the intellectual complexity of cybersecurity as a problem and get all wrapped up in that and forget, that there's a real world out there. So I hope that we can, emerge from our cocoons and reach out to one another again, because I think that's what's going to save us.
Thank you for that, Wendy. And I do hope that will also mean a visit in Geneva at the CyberPeace Institute and an event we could do together. So Wendy, thank you again for agreeing to have these conversations with us, and we look forward to hosting you in person in 2022.
Thank you.